Welcome back. It's the second Sunday of Epiphany, and I'm going to be talking about an A.E. Stallings poem and also the Gospel of John, but I'm going to get to John by wandering through my own experiences very briefly. 3 years ago, I went on a writing retreat in Maine in December, thinking I was going to start a new project, only to discover the many pieces that I had written over the pandemic and then afterwards told a story. Indeed, I had to write some new poems and stories to fill in the gaps, but when it was all said and done, I realized it was a memoir of my 44, now 45 years as a preacher. And then I had to figure out where to start the story. After going back and forth and writing and deleting, I finally started the whole thing in a hospital room in which a family is gathered around a loved one who's dying. And immediately, that was followed by another pericope of life in a hospital room, holding a newborn, blessing her with holy oil. Now, I mention that because I think it may be suggestive about how John probably wrote his gospel. You see, John wrote his story 70 or 80 years after Jesus was executed. And so it was a biography of sorts about someone he didn't know. And what he had in his possession were little bits and pieces of stories people had told and handed down over 2.5 generations. But there were big gaps in those stories. And even if he had copies of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, which he probably may not have, the narration of those Gospels was pretty limited. So he picked through the stories that had made their way to his community and determined which ones he wanted to use and which ones he didn't like. And like the gospel writers before him, all storytellers in fact, including this one, he had to create an overall narrative structure in which to place the stories. We could think of it as a kind of a storyboard. But then there were still big gaps and unanswered questions and more things he wanted us, the readers, to know, or more precisely believe. Because remember, we call him John the Evangelist. He's using his story to evangelize, to invite and persuade us to believe what he believes. Now, I got into this train of thinking because I caught myself staring at the chapter and verse numbers for today's gospel reading from John. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. 2, 1 through 11. I thought to myself, wait a minute. Chapter 1 is Genesis. In the beginning was the Word. How does John get from the beginning of creation to a wedding in Cana of Galilee in one chapter? I had to go back and look. And as I read and reread the first chapter of John, which I've read many times, I was suddenly so impressed with what he had managed to weave together like silk into the first beginning chapter. Now, he went from the Big Bang to a couple of sentences introducing John the Baptist, and back to God entering into human flesh of all things. And then he went back to John the Baptist, who introduced Jesus, and on to Jesus calling his first disciples, who then, like Jesus, declared that, like John, declared Jesus to be God in human flesh. And then John pivots on a dime, and we are suddenly at a wedding in Cana drinking wine. Well, it's a masterful storytelling. And this wedding story is definitely one of John's because it doesn't appear in any of the other Gospels. It's a story that delivers the first proof or an opening argument. Jesus is Lord of chemistry. He can't change blood into milk like his mother did, but he can change water into wine without even touching it. But then John pivots suddenly again from the light to the dark. John rearranges the events told in the other Gospels and launches Jesus into a disruptor and bringer of chaos role, an angry prophet who whips money changers in the temple and denounces capitalism. The whole thing is pretty impressive storytelling, with John weaving cosmic extremes with ordinary stuff quickly and abruptly, and yet somehow kind of smooth so we don't even notice it while we're reading. I've often been harsh with John, which really just reveals my own prejudice because I don't much like people who evangelize. But also because John's gospel was wielded like a sword by orthodoxy in the early history of the church against anyone who disagreed with his take on things. And as you know, I prefer a storyteller like Mark, who just tells us his story and leaves it up to us whether to believe him or not and what to make of it ourselves. John, not so much. He tells us what to believe right up front and all the way through from the beginning to the end. Now, that dialectic between John and Mark is the yin and yang we live in as a people trying to sort out the Gospels and live into their meaning. Well, standing in the presence of John's story about water into wine, all I can say is that there are miracles, but some of us have a harder time believing the ones we haven't seen. Take that A.E. Stalin's poem. Changing blood to milk is a pretty amazing and sweet miracle performed by the mothers of mammals everywhere. I have no problem believing that one. Water to wine without so much as touching it? That's a stretch over the canyon of credulity I don't make very well. It's the kind of miracle I remain agnostic about, by which I mean that I don't have to have an opinion on something I haven't witnessed or experienced myself. I'm a lot like Thomas that way, which, by the way, is also a story from John that doesn't appear in the other Gospels. So look, I'm circling the drain in terms of my life as a parish priest and find myself wanting to both apologize and explain my limitations as a Christian. Why is it that I go out of my way to take jabs at an evangelist and plead agnosticism about a miracle story? Well, when I tell you I'm an agnostic about a story or a belief, meaning I don't know whether to believe it or not, I'm not telling you to be an agnostic. In fact, I admire and am in awe of those with rock-hard belief about things unseen and unexperienced. But I dig into the text and listen to its contradictions, and I stir the pot of orthodoxy in order to point to the other ways of being Christian. Because I have discovered that a whole bunch of people, a whole lot of people, I have served in churches from Indiana to Boston and back, have the same limitations I do. Not everyone, to be sure, and I do worry about that, because not everyone is tough as a friend of mine, Bunny, was. She used to be able to push back and say what she thought, and I've known many others like that too, willing to challenge back and tell me to simmer down. In truth, that's what I wanted everyone to do. So I think a lot of our preachers and teachers in the church miss the mark when they think it's their job to tell people what they are supposed to believe, just the way that John's gospel does. I'm sure it has to do with my own peculiar family history and the decades in which I grew up, but I just do not like people telling me what to believe, whether it's about God or religion or politics or culture. I'd rather we all come to the table with our own beliefs that may be a chaotic disagreement, but that we can allow to rest there at the table with us as we connect with one another through the presence of God. I like to imagine that the table around which we share communion, the one we gather around and pray to God to be present at and to infuse the bread and wine with love, is a place we can hold that can hold all of us, fierce leftists, confirmed Trump supporters, Orthodox Christian believers, faithful skeptics, New Age seekers, old age hangers-on, and everyone in between. Here at our table, all of us, reaching out and holding hands with the love of God that flows through us to one another and beyond. Is that so crazy? It doesn't mean we won't get uncomfortable or even irritate or hurt one another sometimes. It may be roomy in an authentic spiritual community, but we do snuggle in close around the table, and that can make us uncomfortable even as it nurtures us. But really, what's the option? Do we imagine that God is confined to thought silos in which everyone believes and wants the same things all the time? Do we believe that we can learn and grow that way, surrounded only by people who believe and want the same things we do? So John and his gospel represent a huge swath of Christianity, both historic and contemporary. Me and the crazy things I preach, not so many. But still, we're held in the arms of the same community, a community that stopped inquisitions a long time ago. So here we all are at the party, still drinking wine. Some of us thinking it's blood, some of us thinking it's wine, some of us thinking it's non-alcoholic wine that's a symbol of something else, and some of us not knowing quite what to think about this thing that we do. But here we all are at the table, sharing the love of God that moves between us and can be shared beyond us. And really, that's pretty cool. Thank you for being here, part of this extended table. Peace be with you.